Just
there we go. It's broadcasting now, so all the attendees are starting to join. So welcome everybody.
Yeah. Just I can see the number of attendees going up. Just wait.
Yeah. So welcome everybody. We'll just wait a few minutes for everybody to join, and then we'll begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're just about going to get underway here. Just waiting to check that we've got a full house. We're expecting about 140 people who had signed up for the webinar today. So thank you for your support. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Martin Murphy, very pleased to welcome you here today as the Chair of Marine Energy Wales. Welcome indeed to our second webinar. This is the second in a series over the next few months, highlighting the economic benefits that marine energy brings to Wales. Please keep your eyes open for our dates, and if you've missed our last webinar, it's still available for viewing on the Marine Energy Wales YouTube channel, and we'll also be putting this one up today, and it will be recorded accordingly. So, to today's matters, following on from last month's State of the Sector launch, we, in this month's seminar, we're changing tack slightly to delve deeper into floating offshore wind, or FLOW as it's also known, to find out more about the potential of the sector to contribute to a green recovery in Wales. Without doubt, FLOW projects offer up exciting new offshore renewable energy opportunities. We see the merger of well-established wind turbine technology with newer floating technology solutions, which open up the possibility of generating electricity in deeper waters and previously inaccessible sites with much stronger wind resources than the well-established technology from fixed bottom offshore wind. Notably, the Celtic Sea off the coasts of Wales, Ireland and Cornwall represent an exciting frontier in the development and deployment of this technology, with the potential to generate long-term economic benefits to these regions. In this current climate today, we want to highlight how the blue economy can help contribute towards the green recovery. And we have an excellent range of speakers today who will hopefully shine a light on some of the opportunities and challenges in realizing this vision. So as far as the webinar is concerned and its management, all the attendees, you're all on mute with no video, this to ensure everyone can hear the panelists clearly. But if you do need any assistance at any point, please click the raise hand button or send a message on the chat button, and we will seek to help you out. You will be able to see each of our panelists, who we welcome here today, and they will be sharing their screens in turn, showing you a presentation of their interests and projects. We'll be holding two Q&A rounds, one at the halfway point, after we've heard initial presentations about the sector more generally, and then a second one after the developers have given us their viewpoint and their interests, their projects in the second half of this afternoon's event. You can submit your questions via the Q&A icon on the bottom bar, And as I say, please just use the chat button for technical assistance, etc. We will be recording the meeting, as I say, and we will share slides, presentations after the event. We'd also very much like to encourage feedback in relation to the format that we're using for you today. If you've got any comments, then please don't hesitate to send them on our info@marine-energy-wales.co.uk email address. So I hope you've all managed to see the agenda. I think we've got a really good cross-section of presentations for you today. I do hope you'll enjoy it and participate with the questions. And we're going to open up with Jess, Programme Manager from the MEW team, who will give an opening intro and address on the state of the sector. So without more ado, Jess, do you want to step in, please, for your presentation?
Diolch, Martin. Prynhaddau, croeso pawb. My sound okay?
Perfect.
Excellent. As demonstrated in the first webinar of our series, we're seeing an increasing focus on the marine opportunity and what can be realised from harnessing the power of the ocean in the form of wave, tide, and now floating wind energy. Marine Energy Wales brings together technology developers, project developers, the supply chain, academia, and the public sector, seeking to establish Wales as a global leader in sustainable marine energy generation. Our 2019 to 2020 report saw the first inclusion of floating offshore wind, representing the initial investment seen into the Welsh economy, with circa £100,000 seeking to explore the opportunity in the Celtic Sea. Since we went to print in April 2020, our Flow members are reporting that we will have already seen 85 times this figure committed to projects in the Celtic Sea. Increasingly, we're seeing a supportive policy landscape in both Wales and the wider UK for the development of floating offshore wind. At the UK level, we've seen specific strategic commitments from the Conservative government to deliver 2 million new high-quality jobs in clean growth and to enable new floating wind farms. This, alongside encouraging progress with the Contract for Difference round, seeking to provide revenue support for the sector. And here in Wales, ambitious targets for net zero, robust sustainable development principles, and an engaged and proactive government support the sector. Which leads us to seek to understand the true potential that the Celtic Sea represents for Wales and our neighbouring regions. Following on from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult event in January here in Pembrokeshire, we've seen increasing interest and analysis of the potential arising from the development of the Celtic Sea. Reports commissioned and explored in further detail today by my fellow speakers are seeking to understand and highlight the true potential of the Celtic opportunity, with findings identifying that there could be as much as 50 gigawatts potential capacity in the Celtic regions of the Atlantic. This capacity represents a significant opportunity for collaboration with our Celtic neighbours to realise an industry that can benefit peripheral economies in coastal regions. It is anticipated that the first gigawatt of installed power generation in the Celtic Sea represents prospects of 3,000 jobs and a further £682 million of expenditure in supply chain companies in Wales and Cornwall. Here in Wales, in addition to the supportive political landscape, we're also well positioned to maximise this opportunity with pre-existing marine expertise, active and relevant supply chain activities, high-capacity grid networks, and embedded energy industry knowledge associated with our industrial experiences in both oil and gas. However, it is also crucial to recognise that the potential scale of these projects is unprecedented, and no single location nor supply chain player is likely to have the capacity to handle the entirety of demand. Therefore, coordinated regional collaboration is important. To this end, a number of activities are underway to support this burgeoning industry. In October 2019, Wales's Minister for Environment, Energy and Rural Affairs, Lesley Griffiths, launched the Celtic Sea Alliance in Dublin, which brings together key Irish, Cornish and Welsh interests in the sector. Ourselves, Marine Energy Wales, Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly Local Enterprise Partnership, and Marine Renewable Industry Association Ireland, together with a number of developer interests in the Celtic Sea, meet monthly to identify ways in which we can facilitate the sector's progress. This strategic collaboration strives to increase the awareness of the Celtic Sea opportunity, highlighting the benefits of regional cooperation and facilitating mutually beneficial participation in projects in the Celtic Sea. It also seeks to bring the nations of Wales and Ireland and the Great South West region together to identify potential barriers to the industry and find solutions for overcoming them to the benefit of these Celtic regions. This is further supported by the Celtic Sea Offshore Floating Wind Cluster. This industrial cluster formalises a partnership between the regions of Cornwall and Wales. MEW's participation in the cluster facilitates a cohesive approach, sharing our knowledge and experiences of the sector here in Wales, and alongside ORE Catapult's technical expertise and regional presence, further strengthens the collaboration cross borders. The cluster seeks to support many of the aims of the Celtic Sea Alliance through the delivery of practical solutions and engagement activities. Keep your eye out for notification of these in our newsletter. Ultimately, we're working to increase business competitiveness, support greater innovation, attract new entrants, and grow existing companies in the delivery of the floating offshore wind opportunity that we will now hear about from my fellow speakers. Diolch am wrando. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks for the introduction. That's really helpful. I just wanted to pick up on a point that's already been raised in the chat from Andy Bilcliffe from the Morlaix team up in North Wales. Just really to confirm that whilst we're talking, perhaps there is more of a focus on the name Celtic Sea in this series of presentations this afternoon, but we are talking about the development of floating offshore wind as a pan-Wales development. So please understand that we are talking in the wider Wales context here, although the Celtic Sea in its true geography is more to the southwest. So Andy, I hope that eases your mind, but this is very much a pan-Wales presentation, series of presentations and intent. Okay, so moving on, I'd like now to introduce to you Marf Smith, who is the Energy and Environment Director for Lumen. Marf is going to give us some insight now into the current policy environment for floating offshore wind. Marf, over to you.
Martin, thank you for that. And Andy, I'm sure North Wales won't be left behind, and you already are ahead in offshore wind, of course, anyway. We're a pioneer in offshore wind in the UK, and there's lots of plans for offshore wind. And floating could, of course, play a role in North Wales when platform technologies and other things come on. But the focus, I think, rightly is in the southwest, where the deeper waters lay and where the resource is. But this is definitely a pan-Wales, pan-UK opportunity. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to just share with you. I've got my screen shared. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right. So, just briefly about Lumen Energy and Environment. I'm founding director of the company. Previously, I was with Renewable UK. Many of you will know me from there. I've been working, set up Lumen at the start of the year, and we're focused on energy transition. We're doing work on lithium supply chain. We're doing work on ScotWind. We're doing work with GWEC, the Global Wind Energy Council, looking at taking offshore wind global and helping support emerging markets. And I also have a number of clients, for example, Seawind, an OEM focused on floating offshore wind, and clients looking at ScotWind, who again, looking at options, fixed and floating. So there's a lot happening in this space, and obviously as an industry, we're very busy. Other things I do, I'm the vice chair of GWEC's new floating offshore wind task force. I'm going to talk about that briefly, and I'm also a specialist advisor to the Environmental Audit Committee, which some of you will know is doing a series of technology inquiries. It's done offshore wind and hydrogen, and it's as a set of inquiries it's planning for when it returns after recess. So, briefly about GWEC's floating offshore wind task force. Just started, we had a meeting just before summer. Henrik has despite lockdown, the Danes all still went on holiday. We had to have a meeting, just before some of the GWEC membership left and went off to their country houses on the coast, as it were. So we met. We've got a really great expert group of some of the leading industry players. Alongside that, we have currently our UK and the Japanese Wind Power Association, who are representing associations. We expect others to come on board. But the first thing the task force will be doing is looking at what our focus market should be. There's a number of markets where offshore and floating is opening up rapidly, but the critical thing for GWEC is where can it make a difference? For example, the UK market maybe seems to be essentially working or either in hand, but what markets might need support to really get accelerated. So we'll be looking at the policy and regulation, how we can support governments and other national associations to learn about floating and put the right policies in place, coordinating stakeholder groups, because in the international policy sphere, it's often confusing as to who to engage with, international governmental bodies, NGOs, etc. GWEC seeks to coordinate that, as well as talking to NGOs, stakeholders, etc., and running events, primarily virtual, of course, at the moment, but GWEC has a series of international events it runs, and we want to make floating a bigger theme in some of those. So, to today's talk. Firstly, a reminder about offshore wind. This is a graph using Renewable UK data showing offshore wind. This is almost all fixed. It is. There are a few schemes, of course, in here that are relating to floating, but the UK is, of course, a leader in offshore wind. We have approximately 12 gigawatts of offshore wind, either in operation or under construction. Since the election, though, we have a commitment from the government to up our 30 gigawatt 2030 target to 40 gigawatt. So that essentially means almost increasing by a factor of 3 plus the amount of offshore wind we have to build between now and end of decade. And that's an unprecedented growth. And we're going to do that. And we're going to also seek to develop and bring on and accelerate floating offshore wind. And that's important because we won't stop at 2030, but we'll continue out past that to 2050. And the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, says that we'll need at least 75 gigawatts of offshore wind, fixed and floating, if we're to hit net zero. So there is significant opportunity and a necessity, if you will, for this technology. In my role at Renewable UK, supported Rebecca Williams, who many of you know, in the political and policy work that was done to get floating on the map in terms of it's seen as a priority by UK government. That work was ultimately successful. It led to government recently consulting on use of the CFD to support floating. And the work we did was around a change of mindset, where government thought that it had done fixed, as it were, and it was for other markets to do floating, and there wasn't a UK play. We were able to change their mind by showcasing 3 things. One, the scale of activity required to hit net zero, and the viability, indeed the desirability of offshore wind as a low-cost technology, and the opportunities for floating to join that as a low-cost technology as well. 2, the supply chain benefits that could come from that, particularly in transition and helping the UK's oil and gas sector transition, which is critically important for the southwest of Wales, as well as, of course, northeast Scotland. And 3, the relative benefits or the potential for benefits from being an early mover into floating offshore wind, one of those nations that gets floating offshore wind, that learns, that can export services and goods, etc., to those other markets as they open up. And over a couple of year program of engagement with government at different levels, we were able to make it understand and realize this wider opportunity, and hence get that support. So we're at the start of something really interesting. There's a lot of activity in the market, but we'll see a lot more to come, and I'll touch on some of that later, as well as talking about some of the global perspectives. So current status, that graph I've just showed you, this shows you it as a pie chart. Again, it shows you the amount of wind at different stages. Almost all of this, again, is fixed. On your right, you can see the map of the Celtic Seas. There's a lot of floating offshore wind potential there. Obviously, as Jess said in her presentation, estimates for up to 50 gigawatts of floating offshore wind. But that small circle that's drawn on that map, that is the pie chart as currently exists for floating offshore wind, roughly by scale. Actually, it's probably not quite to scale. It's probably bigger than it should be. But when I tried to scale it, it disappeared from the computer screen. So that small circle is a pie chart. So that shows you the relative scale of fixed versus floating at the moment. So we need to, as it were, think in proportions. But it won't stay that way for long. And particularly because of ScotWind, as much and as well as the prospecting activities that we're seeing in the southwest, the activities we're seeing in Ireland, a lot of work now going on, and we expect more and more projects to come forward very quickly. That small circle, that shows you it in terms of the known projects. This is again from Renewable UK data. It tracks known projects. So there are plans for obviously a wider portfolio, but this relies essentially upon initial development activity starting. So we have the Hywind Scotland scheme operational, Kincardine, the first turbine operational, of course, and the second phase being built, and then the Erebus project underway, which you're going to hear a lot about later from David and Christoph. But we will see, assuming that the changes being proposed by the CFD to have an auction round focused on innovative technologies, to create a third pot that offshore wind, the fixed offshore wind, moves into, so that can continue to be supported at scale. That and the leasing processes and other political and policy work that's going on will support floating offshore wind and help it to come forwards, dependent of course on things like small things like what price will the auction run at, what will the rules of the auction. A lot to do to make sure that's a viable system, but a good start, and of course a commitment from the Prime Minister down that the UK government sees a role for floating, and that's worth holding on to. If we look at the global pipeline just briefly, this shows you a pipeline of offshore wind farms. It shows you those both in operation, construction, consented in planning, development, and clearly most of the floating offshore wind schemes, not unexpectedly, are in the development phase. So that shows you a rapid upscaling of new projects coming in around the market. Still small compared to the growth of fixed globally, but expected to grow. And the national policies and changes will be important in trying to drive those different markets forwards. And obviously the pace at which those different markets will go forwards. We have markets with high potential, but sufficient fixed capacity that those markets are saying publicly they'll focus on fixed at the moment until either technology prices fall or there begin to be constraints. And you can see, if you like, similarity to how that has worked in the UK market. Briefly, foundation type, it's important to understand there's a lot of work being done on foundation types. There are many different variants in the market. There are clear leaders in the market, though, of course, and equally, if you look at the data as it's such as it is, the market clearly prefers the semi-submersibles, and the projects are moving ahead on the back of those. But even going out, so future planning schemes, you can see still interest in advanced SPA, for example. So we can expect to see continued diversity in this market. There's a lot of learning still to be done from these early stage projects, and of course different sea conditions, different construction options, which will suit different platform technology. In terms of the markets, the biggest market, and by far by defined projects, is South Korea, followed by France. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those are the largest markets, because a lot depends on timescale. It depends on the revenue and market mechanisms that could support those schemes to come forwards. Essentially, come off the drawing board or come off the development plan into construction. But you can see a range of countries in that market. Saudi Arabia, of course, has a scheme, a very large scheme that's being planned. Italy, a large scheme in the Med being planned. So many of these schemes have questions over them in terms of how they will be funded. the path to market and route to commercialization for those developers, but no shortage of appetite now emerging. And on the right, you can see a map. This comes by GWEC from Advent RE, who do work on the Offshore Wind Task Force, and a recent World Bank report showing average wind speeds and water depths. The dark red at less than 50 and the pink at less than 250, so 50 to 250. So you can see significant areas which are better suited for floating offshore wind around the world. And indeed, if you look at GWEC's own estimates, this is their forecast out to after post 2030. So you can see on the left there, 2018 current, 2020, 25 to 2030. So by 2030, they expect 5% of the market to be using floating platforms, but post 2030 to grow to up to 40%. So a significant change as that our floating market commercializes, as the costs fall, as some markets, such as UK, for example, come across find constraints in fixed. That means we're prepared to go further out, either for better wind regimes or to avoid issues such as constraints or cumulative impact. And that's backed up by a recent study by the World Bank that's working with GWEC. Their Going Global project, looking at how they expand offshore wind to emerging markets. This was a study of that, if you like, the first set of new markets that governments that the World Bank is supporting. And this shows you the potential in those different markets by fixed and floating. And what's interesting, you can see that there's twice the amount of potential in floating across that set of markets. So for example, the last one, Vietnam, there's a lot of activity in Vietnam in fixed offshore wind as well as onshore wind. I expect to see Vietnam focus the activity on fixed at the moment. It's an understood technology, there's a set of developers ready, but there are companies looking at floating in Vietnam. And there's a support framework with the World Bank, helping Vietnam to understand some of the policies that might be needed. South Wales, of course, this a capture from the Excellent State of the Sector report that Jess highlighted at the start. There's a lot happening in South Wales. There's a lot of activity in terms of thinking about how we can utilize that expertise, utilize that resource. There's a lot of discussions. I'm personally involved in discussions, for example, about energy transition around Milford Haven, around the utilization of the Pembrokeshire demonstration zone. Expect to see a lot of investment in this area, and I'm talking to supply chain companies in this part of the world who are working in oil and gas, or have worked in fixed offshore wind, and now want to understand and transition, as it were, into floating offshore wind. And the time is right. And what's interesting, if you're part of this discussion, is how quickly it's gone from something that was over the horizon to something that is seen as an investment that's required here and now. Initiatives like the South Wales Industrial Cluster and the hydrogen route mapping that's going on obviously can play a part and help to embed expertise, help the manufacturing sector in South Wales stay viable, stay low carbon, or become low carbon, and help transition in the gas sector that's obviously so important around the Milford Haven Basin. And there is already a supply chain ready that can grow, and that shows you an excerpt from the Renewable UK's supply chain map showing you companies winning work already in the offshore wind space. So that's all from me. I hope that's helpful intro and setting the scene ahead of what I hope is going to be a varied, interesting debate and a set of presentations I'm very much looking forward to. So Martin, thank you, and back to you.
Matt, thank you very much indeed for that sort of insight, not only local but global, in terms of opportunity which floating offshore wind presents. Now, of course, our industry, this growing industry, has attracted a lot of interest, and Carbon Trust, as a highly esteemed organisation in the renewable energy space, have done much work themselves. And I'm delighted to welcome Megan Smith from the Carbon Trust now to give us a summary of some of the work that's been done by Carbon Trust and which has been recently published. So Megan, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me and see my slides?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yes, my name is Megan Smith. I'm head up the Offshore Wind Advisory team here at Carbon Trust. And thanks for giving us this opportunity just to talk through one of the pieces of work we've recently published. So just for those of you who don't know the Carbon Trust, we've been working in offshore wind for well over 10 years now, and we sort of mainly work with government and industry to accelerate and further develop offshore wind. We do sort of two main areas of work. The first is kind of advisory, so we advise public and private sector clients on the markets, the policy, industrial strategy and technology innovation required for offshore wind, and we do that globally. So we work very much across the world in the US, Japan, Taiwan, and obviously in Europe. And on the other side, we run joint industry programs, which are sort of bringing together industry to accelerate and reduce the costs in offshore wind. Our three main projects that we're running on that at the moment is the first is the Offshore Wind Accelerator Programme, which has been running for 12 years and has delivered over £100 million worth of R&D in offshore wind. And actually that programme alone so far, it's ongoing, but so far it's directly reduced the cost of offshore wind by over 15%. The second is our Floating Wind Joint Industry Programme, which I'll talk a bit more about today. And that was started in 2016, and I'll give you a bit more overview in a second. And then the final one is the snappily titled Offshore Renewable Joint Industry Project, which despite the name is about addressing consenting risks for wind, mainly focused on the UK. Just to sort of go back a little bit to the points that Matt was making before, you know, we've heard that floating wind has significant potential. And here we can see, this is from Carbon Trust analysis, the future global potential for offshore wind. The UK is the orange section, and as you can see, we expect to be a not insignificant portion of that global growth. But there are still quite significant challenges and barriers to the development of floating wind. We've seen that the cost of floating wind, especially on the global scale, is still very high. So new technology needs to develop, and the risk and cost need to sort of continue to come down. So that's where the Floating Wind Joint Industry Programme came in. So this was set up in 2016 in a response to that need. It's bringing together 14 floating wind developers that you can see listed here, and is also funded by Scottish Government. So to date, we've invested over so almost 4 million in R&D projects, which has been 70% funded by industry, and we use the sort of market pull approach. So we identify the challenges and barriers, and then look and see what technologies and innovations can then meet those needs from the client perspective. This is a very complicated slide, but basically highlights the different projects that we've either completed to date or are currently underway. We have limited time today, so I'm not going to talk about it all. I'm going to focus on these 4 projects here, which have been shared in detail last month in our phase 2 summary report. And that's available on our website. So if you would like to read more about them, it's an interesting read for sure. And I'm also going to just touch briefly on the technology competition, because that has some nice links into Wales. And then give a brief, very brief overview on the remaining projects, just to set the scene really. Sorry, just going back, I'll be going through these first 4 phase 2 projects today, and just giving you a really high level overview of these. So the first of these is looking at turbines for floating wind. So apologies for you that may be experts in floating wind already. I'm not sure of the range of people on the call, so I'm going to give a little bit of background, but essentially most floating concepts currently use existing turbine designs for fixed wind and then put them on a floating platform. And that's fine, it's good that we can use that technology, but there are challenges with that. Mainly the loading for floating turbines is very different to the loading for fixed. So the movement on a floating turbine would mean that actually the loading is different. So we need different considerations. Furthermore, we're seeing turbine sizes continue to grow, which is good because we're seeing that's more cost-effective way of delivering wind. But those larger turbine sizes that have been demonstrated for fixed, so 12 and increasing megawatts, we've only seen up to 7 megawatts demonstrated for floating. So there's a bit of a gap there. So that project, the sort of outcomes for that is that we've seen that floating foundations scale well with larger turbines, but we need that improved interface between the turbine and the tower and the foundation. And in the long term, as we've seen, that there's a real, quite a significant market for floating, actually developing specific floating turbines, so turbines specific for floating wind could be cost effective and beneficial. So the second project was looking at heavy lift operations. So when you're installing or maintaining, for that matter, floating turbines offshore, you need very, very big boats and very big cranes, essentially. And we don't have many of those on the market at the moment. And what we do have on the market is very expensive to hire and operate. So that's a key barrier for developing floating wind on a commercial scale. If we don't have the boats to install these things, we can't scale it up. So we need to develop these heavy lift vessels with motion compensation and bring those to market, really. This project also looked at new solutions, so like climbing cranes, and concluded that these do offer potential, but we need to make sure these are demonstrated accordingly, because this is doing things in a very different way to how we've done it traditionally. So the third project of the 4 is looking at monitoring and inspection. So with any new technology, there are new risks. When the natural thing is to compare fixed and floating, fixed wind's been, we've had projects in the water for decades now. We know where these projects are likely to fail. We know where the turbines are likely to fail. We know how to look out for it. We know what the risks are. We don't have that kind of knowledge and insight with floating. So that massively increases the risk of this technology. So understanding how best to monitor and understanding the risks and understanding how best to monitor for these failures is really important. And what we found was that there's no quick win solutions, and that unfortunately remote monitoring, so where we don't actually have to go out in person, we don't have to send divers underwater, are quite limited for mooring lines, and therefore sort of monitoring devices for mooring systems are in need of further development. And then finally, final project that I'm going to go through today is looking at dynamic export cable development. So again, in fixed wind, generally you have the export cables nicely buried under a couple of meters of rock or mud or sand, and they're quite safe under there, generally speaking. In floating wind, you don't necessarily have that. Obviously, they're coming down from a floating platform potentially, and therefore need to be able to manage the loads that are associated with that sort of dynamic cable. So as a result of that, they're likely to be heavier, stiffer, larger in diameter, and have larger minimum bend radii. So you can't coil them onto a drum as easily. So which means that actually installing them offshore, there's extra challenges with that. So understanding what those risks are likely to be is key. So we don't have high voltage dynamic cables on the market at the moment. We have medium voltage cables. And what we found is that a lot of learnings from the development of the medium voltage dynamic cables can be applied to high voltage, but it's not a copy and paste, it's not scaling up. There will be specific handling requirements need to be developed for those high voltage export cables as well. And on top of that, we are supporting 5 international cable companies to further develop their designs of dynamic high voltage cables as well, in order to overcome these design and manufacturing challenges. And you can see those companies listed there. So that was a quick run through of those 4 projects. I want to touch on this technology competition as well, that's ongoing at the moment. So we've just sort of launched this fairly recently, and this is the Floating Wind Technology Acceleration Competition is a £1 million grant funding competition, essentially, to accelerate technologies which overcome 4 key challenges. And you can see those sort of demonstrated here, and those are how to carry out heavy lift maintenance offshore safely and effectively, how to connect and disconnect turbines for tow to port maintenance, and also protect the cables and mooring lines left behind. The remote monitoring and inspection of wind turbines that I touched on earlier, and then obviously the development of novel mooring line technologies as well. So this funding was provided by the Scottish Government, and we are now awarded support to 8 projects across these four challenges. And I just wanted to highlight one, the Intelligent Moorings, which is a Welsh company and a Marine Energy Wales member. And they are working with the University of Exeter, looking at mooring system challenges by developing a mooring line dampener. So that's essentially a system that slows down the movement of the export cables as they're sort of floating under the water. The funding for this project will progress this design of the dampener through to scale testing at the DMAC lab facilities in Exeter. And the project team have already secured funding for an offshore testing site in Pembrokeshire as well. So we're expecting that demonstration to start in spring next year. And it will be a 1 to 3 scale in regards to water depth, and a 1 to 5.6 scale with regards to estimated mooring loads. So yeah, we'll see the deployment in spring and hopefully a second deployment in autumn as well. But that's quite a nice example of the actual technologies that we're looking to actually bring to market through this programme too. So just finally to touch on the remaining projects that are underway, I don't have that much more to say on these at the moment. We've just launched a lot of these, but we publish information as we close out projects fairly regularly. So hopefully in a year or so's time, I'll have more to say on that. And also just to sort of highlight the nature of this programme, the phase 1 and 2 projects were mainly focused on desk-based studies, really understanding what the problems were, what the challenges were we're looking at, and how could we look to address them. Phase 3 and 4, we're really now moving into this sort of demonstration and development of specific technologies to address those challenges and issues that we're seeing in the market. So hopefully we'll see a lot more actual, large-scale demonstration projects coming through this as well. That's it from me. I'll be answering any questions in the Q&A, but there are some links to the information we've published as well, if you want any more details. So thank you.
Megan, thank you so much. I mean, in 15 minutes, you can only give us a very small taster of the depth and breadth of work that is actually going on in this sector already. I think you've successfully done that, and certainly access to those reports and the links that you've given us there will I'm sure help delegates, with any specific questions, but you may get bombarded yet here in our short Q&A session itself.
That's fine.
So moving on, I'd like now to introduce Neil Farrington. He's from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult team as an innovation manager in Hale in Cornwall. And I know Neil has been looking in particular at typical constraint mapping for floating wind, and specifically in the Celtic Sea for this particular element of work, and which he's going to present to us now. So Neil, can I hand over to you, please? Neil, are you on mute?
Sorry, it's always one, isn't there? So thanks for the introduction, Martin. Yeah, so I'm just going to give you a quick background on some of the Catapult activity in the area, and then really focus on some of the spatial opportunities in the Celtic Sea. So we've heard quite a bit there about the global opportunity, the potential gigawatts that could be deployed, and hopefully what I'll bring this back to is what we can do in the Celtic Sea, and specifically on the Welsh side as well. So I'll just start with a quick background. So for those of you that don't know, the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult is the UK's leading technology innovation and research centre for offshore wind, wave and tidal. So we've been engaged in a number of activities that have developed around the Celtic Sea, again with the Celtic Sea Alliance and the Celtic Sea Cluster. And last year we also launched the Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence, that effectively brings together public bodies, a group of stakeholders and industry, again to look at challenges in particular UK markets. So that really brings our focus on to the northwest of Scotland and down in the Celtic Sea in the southwest. So we specifically have offices operating out of Cornwall, which is where I'm based, as well as the Marine Energy Engineering Centre of Excellence in Pembroke, which is MEWS for short, and is probably best to stick to. We've also produced a couple of reports over the last year or two that gained a particular interest for this subject. So we had a broader macroeconomic report produced back in 2018, looking at the floating offshore wind opportunity for the UK. And then towards the tail end of last year, we also produced a supply chain report that very much focuses on the southwestern Wales. So participants on the call are interested around areas of floating wind development, how it may fit in with their business now or in the future. That's a very useful report to pick up on. So I'll now move on to some details of the spatial mapping work that's just been completed. So really just at the start of this year, we had some support through MEWS and the European Regional Development Fund to commission ITP Energize to complete some spatial mapping work around the Celtic Sea. So that report has a number of key intentions that are really key to understand. Again, as with all of these types of reports, when we start producing maps and numbers, they're very dependent on the inputs that go into the modelling. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background there. And probably best to start with the fact the whole aim of this report is to start a conversation and have some more informed and rationalised discussions around potential development areas. It isn't a fait accompli. And people will certainly have different views on the way we've generated the report and some of the weighting that's been done. But just running from the top, so one of our really key aims was to look at taking a proactive approach to understanding the spatial potential for floating wind. So again, looking at the Celtic Sea, working with the Welsh Government, the Cornwall LEP, other research organisations to understand where that potential may be. So again, what hasn't been done a lot to date is try and focus down on actual development areas. So clearly, as we've seen, the Celtic Sea is a very wide space. We won't potentially develop floating wind across the whole area because of a number of conditions. So we've tried to factor them into the spatial mapping and start to get a grip of where the likely development areas may be, what potential distances from coastlines may be, understanding where we may want to actually place potential development areas, whether that's through a policy context, a planning context, or trying to target research into those areas. So really getting a grip on where we may want to go first, essentially. And a big part of that work has looked at identifying the area of least constraint. So again, this isn't a technical analysis that has effectively said we can only develop wind in a specific area. What we've done is looked at the whole Celtic Sea, applied a number of constraints, and then tried to look at the areas where there's likely to be least conflict and objection. So one of the other critical things that's happening here, we're trying to take on board the vast range of stakeholders' views early on in the development process. So we don't leave contentious issues such as dealing with seabirds until we get to the planning application stage. We try and head that off with more of a strategic planning approach. Another critical aspiration of this work has also been to influence the Southwest Marine Plan. So we had the Southwest Marine Plan was out at draft at the start of the year. They're looking to conclude that at the start of next year. And originally we had no real reference to floating wind. So effectively it was dismissed from the 20-year planning policy because it wasn't yet commercially viable. What you would have started to understand now from the previous presentations, things have moved really, really rapidly in the last couple of years, and those aspirations have changed very dramatically. So we worked really closely with the MMO to look at making sure we not only have a specific floating wind policy, but we also look at a potential development area. Now that has a key advantage in terms of providing material planning weight when we get further through the development process. Now, unfortunately, we were a little bit late for the Wales Marine Plan, but we have been having discussions with some of the statutory consultees involved there about how we could potentially work some of these opportunities into the next revision of the plan. So going beyond resource area identification and trying to build in a much more constrained model. Although I should say that can be problematic because we're reliant on making some subjective decisions, which people aren't always keen on. And I'll explain a bit more about that when I get to some of the constraints we've used. As I said, this does have clear aspects of technical analysis in terms of looking at bathymetry, looking at wind speed, but I need to state very clearly this isn't an economic analysis. So we haven't, for example, constrained the mapping due to the distance from a port that could have an economic impact on project development. And clearly some of those functions very much depend on the final technology that's chosen and the actual developer requirements for those areas. So we haven't restricted in that way. We've also been keen to try and accelerate the leasing and licensing process. So again, I sort of touched on the planning policy context there. Potentially we were just missing a 20-year opportunity to have a floating wind policy in the Southwest Marine Plan. So we've jumped on that one quickly. We've also done some early work with the Crown Estate to support their consideration for key resource areas. So this really relates to the leasing that we'll need for floating wind. And really positively, the Crown Estate are now looking at starting their initial mapping work towards the end of the year. When we spoke about it in December last year, we were talking about 10 years for that process. That's now looking at an acceleration to key resource area determination later this year. So that's a huge jump ahead, both in terms of recognition of all the work and support that can go into those processes now, but equally understanding that opportunity that exists. One of the other key intentions is also to look at a lack of data. So one of the issues that comes up quite frequently is a lack of data for sites, particularly when we get out into the Celtic Sea areas that haven't really been surveyed. They haven't had much oil and gas interest previously. So there's quite a lack of data in some areas. And again, what we've done with the spatial mapping is pick out particular data layers so we can see where those gaps are. We can then meet with stakeholders, discuss the issues with them, and potentially target public resource and funding towards those target areas. So really what we're aiming here is taking the whole Celtic Sea, focusing it down on potential development areas, and then targeting future research and funding into that area. So it gives us a chance to actually start on a type of pre-consenting process that again can potentially accelerate development. So a good example there, any developer, you're looking at 2 or 3 years for bird surveys, and potentially we could kick off that activity earlier and actually provide the information to the developers, so it moves that process on more quickly. It's starting to look a bit more like the Danish development model for onshore renewables that people may be familiar with. And the last key intention of the report was also to help rationalise some of the sector benefits. So as I mentioned before, we've done a supply chain report looking at the potential benefits to Wales, for example, from floating wind. Until we know where the sites may be, what the technology is, what the anchoring technology may be, it's hard to rationalise some of those benefits. So the more we know about the technology and the potential sites, the better we can rationalise that approach. So quite a few ambitious aims. And as I was saying, what I really wanted to see here was a focus on potential development areas that can kick off further discussions and debate. So just jumping straight into the data layers and weighting, as you probably expect, there's a 70-page report that sits behind this work, and that's available up on the Catapult website, and I will have a link at the end of the presentation, so you can get some more details on how that weighting process was carried out. Probably just a couple of big things to mention initially. There has been spatial mapping work done before, and what it tends to do is focus just on technical constraints. So you would look, for example, at bedrock lithology, catenary thickness, wave height and wind speed, for example. So you would take those 4 technical constraints and then map out the likely development areas. Now, the reason that happens quite often is, as you'd expect, when you start to weight fishing over navigation, over potential access routes, there's quite a lot of subjective decisions that need to be made, and it can raise areas of conflict. So I've had this same chat with Natural Resources Wales as well. What's tended to happen, people have stepped back from going that extra stage where things can become quite contentious. We've sort of gone to the opposite extreme, included 29 data layers, and have opened it up for discussion and debate, as I was saying. So it's a slightly different approach here. Just to give you an idea of what we did with some of the constraints there, and I'm going to show you the results in a minute. We effectively took out a lot of areas of hard constraint. One difference there that may not be followed up with developers is potentially taking out all the environmentally sensitive areas. Again, there are options to look at co-location. Obviously, it's important to understand the potential effects of any wind development on those areas before you exclude them. Again, what we were looking to do here is find the area of least constraint. So effectively, we're taking them out of this initial mapping process. We then move into the weighted constraints. And again, this is quite a tricky thing to do, and we spoke to quite a few stakeholders about it. And we've rationalised those decisions in the report. But effectively, a key part of our thinking there was thinking in the long term. So if we're going to plan out wind farm development over the next 20 years, it potentially gives us opportunities to have discussions with the MOD, for example. So when we started looking at military exercise areas across the southwest, it covered a really broad stretch of sea space. We actually had follow-up conversations with the Navy at Culdrose. They were very specific about the exercise areas they did use and those they didn't. And that effectively enabled us to take out that constraint from a lot of the mapping. So again, these conversations that need to be had with statutory consultees and stakeholders will likely see this work revised as we go forward. Just to give you one other example, visual impact, again, really contentious issue people will have very different views on. We effectively ended up setting 2 buffers. So the 30 kilometres really picks up on some work that was done by the Crown Estate previously in setting a visual buffer from protected areas. What we've seen at Wave Hub, for example, is that being 24 kilometres off the coast doesn't necessarily stop landscape objections, heritage objections, tourism objections based on visibility. So effectively, we've built in this extra 45-kilometre visual buffer that starts to alleviate some of those issues. Again, very happy to chat to anyone about this more in detail at another point. NATS radar, again, you could potentially take that out as a hard constraint because it is difficult to deal with and get permission in those areas. But we're doing lots of work at Wave Hub again, for example, around radar mitigation. So again, through stakeholder engagement, technology advancement, that may not actually be a hard constraint and it may be something that's manageable. So that really process of understanding what we can do in terms of a strategic approach to long-term planning for wind had a really big effect on what we did. Then just jumping down to the reference data layers there. And again, people will be familiar with some of these issues. Some of the data sets we have on marine mammals, for example, are really low resolution. So unless you blank out the entire Celtic Sea because there's been a few sightings of marine mammals, it's very hard to determine the spatial area where there's a real significant impact or where an effect could be. So we've dropped in lots of data layers to the report, which effectively highlight the data we have, the data that's missing, and gives us an opportunity again to target that future research in those areas. So once we have a better definition of where the wind farms could potentially be developed, we could then deploy technologies to measure marine mammal movements. So it's really trying to make things more specific and focus down the spatial considerations rather than just looking at a huge expanse of sea. So that is all my excuses and the background and covering the results I'm going to show you next. So I'm just going to now jump on to some of those results of the mapping and show you some of the areas that were determined. Again, one thing I'll do is I'll just give you a bit of description here, is try and relate. Sorry, my visualization thing's just. Yeah, so as I was saying, what we did here is effectively identified those areas of least constraint. So the 5 zones you can now see, that just again that picks up Welsh waters and areas within the Southwest Marine Plan. Those areas were identified as the areas of least constraint based on the weighted constraints I showed on the previous slide. So it starts to give us a bit of focus around what could be possible and where we may want to put it. Again, what we're not trying to do here is exclude any areas outside those zones. It could very well be feasible to develop them. There may be some increased risk, but again, that's a decision we're really leaving open for the developers as they come forward. So large scale numbers there. The whole area is looking at 25,000 square kilometres for that Celtic Sea area of least constraint. So again, gives you a bit of an idea where it sits. But the other step we took that again is open for debate and discussion. Up at the Catapult, we've been doing a lot of work with 15 megawatt turbines and are actually now working on 20 megawatt turbine versions. So when we started to look at some of the potential capacity that could be deployed in those areas, we focused it on a 15 megawatt turbine initially, and that set some of the parameters for our spacing. Now, the reason we've also got a range there is again that turbine separations are very much based on the locations, on wind direction, anchoring types, mooring lines, developer preference. It's very hard to come up with a single conclusive answer. So effectively we produced the range. Now the high range you can see there at 4.8 megawatts per kilometre squared. That's effectively based on a turbine spacing of 6 rotor diameters by 9, initially running perpendicular to the wind and then in line with it. We then jump up to a mid-range at 3 megawatts per kilometre squared. So that's a figure that has been used in a few different reports to look at floating wind capacity. And then we drop down to the 2 megawatts per kilometre squared, which is actually some of the spacing we've seen with some of the fixed wind turbines. So the Hornsey wind farm, for example. So again, that gives us a bit of a range there. The other sort of critical things to pick out here is some of the numbers and the level of potential deployment we're talking about. So we touched on it earlier in one of the previous presentations. Current offshore wind deployment across the UK is about 14 gigawatts. As you can now see, we're potentially looking at 120 gigawatts that could be deployed in those zones, but it's far, far in excess of anything that's happened with the industry to date. So again, this isn't going to all happen at once for numerous reasons I won't run into, but gives us a good idea of what's possible in the long term. I'm just now going to quickly jump onto the Welsh zone. So again, give you a bit more context there, a bit more understanding around that area. So the Welsh zone is zone 5. Effectively, it's bounded on the north side by the EEZ limit and bounded on the east side by SPA. Again, there's potential opportunities to expand this zone, but it gives us somewhere to start from initially. So that area is looking at nearly 4,000 kilometres squared. So again, a significant space. We're looking at average wind speeds between 10 and 12 metres per second. So that's slightly above average for what we would see for the whole of Celtic Sea, which would be about 9.5 metres per second. And again, another point just to pick out there, based on the current data that's available and modelling that's been done, we can only project at 100 metres. So you can see one of the future actions here would be to take some of the funding we'll hopefully have by the end of the year and potentially look at floating LiDAR deployments. So we can not only get more consistent detailed data, but we can get it at the right likely hub height, which is obviously useful, again, for understanding the potential, but also for supporting this sort of pre-consenting process. Significant wave height is good. So generally we're looking at a 2.5 metre significant wave height limit in terms of access, although there's also economic issues here in terms of loading on turbines and different structures. So again, a few considerations there, but as it would currently stand, no issues in terms of accessing that zone for O&M, for example. The bathymetry range is the 70 to 150 metres. So again, this is sort of an area of open debate at the moment. We have mapped bathymetry in relation to floating wind from 60 to 200 metres. That 60 metre initial limit is based on the work that's going on through CFD allocations and other Crown Estate leasing rounds, where effectively fixed wind has stopped at 60 metres. So there's an opportunity to pick up floating wind from that point. Again, that'll be a feature of future discussion, I'm sure. Another critical feature there, the closest point of zone 5 to the coastline is 49 kilometres. So again, we're looking at a significant buffer here in terms of visual inference and effect. And again, just to give you a slight contrast, the North Hoyle wind farm is 7.5 kilometres from the coast, and Gwynty Moor is 18 kilometres. So again, some of those initial objections and conflict that may be seen about visual inference and effect on heritage, for example, we're trying to consider in this early stage of spatial mapping. Then just to throw some of these big deployment numbers at you, and again, just to make a really clear point here, that this is theoretical potential. So this is packing turbines as close proximity as we possibly can without restricting their performance. Practically, the level is likely to be lower. So again, if we want to have a navigation route through the site, we've lost some of the space for turbine deployment. So there are other considerations that need to go into these figures, but we have to start somewhere. Then just to give you an idea of the potential turbine numbers that would produce. So we're between 1,300 and 526 turbines there, based on the different deployment capacities. So again, a real significant number and many more turbines than we've seen to date. But hopefully this helps you to start to understand some of those supply chain benefits. So we've got an idea of the type of turbine numbers we might be deploying, and hence lengths of chain we need, number of anchor points we need, and other technical details. I also thought I'd just chuck a generation figure in there for you. So obviously we're talking lots about gigawatts and terawatt hours and things here. So I just thought it'd be useful to put it into the Welsh context. Now, if we take those turbine numbers and we apply a 50% capacity factor, which is actually quite conservative, and the Hywind project has been looking at capacity factors upwards of 60%. So this is a relatively conservative number. What that could potentially produce is 561 to 231% of Wales's annual electricity demand in 2018. So this is way beyond what Wales is currently using, but it's also worth thinking of this in the context of future electrification. So that electrical demand is likely to go up. Potentially, if we started to try and project that out to sort of 2050, demand would clearly be higher, and the wind farm would likely be closer to meeting the total consumption. So again, lots we can debate there, lots of technical points you can dance around. But effectively, hopefully, we're providing a good idea of what's possible, where's least constrained, where we could potentially put it, and what some of the other effects and conflicts are that we need to deal with early on. So squeeze a huge amount in there. Please give me a call. The report is now online if you want to have a look in more detail, and very, very happy to discuss any of those issues with anyone that's interested.
Oh, Neil, thank you so much for that. Again, a really interesting insight. Then homing in perhaps more closely on the Welsh interest, but really interesting work. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so we can move into a Q&A session. And as I look at the open questions at the moment, Beth, can you help me here? I can see we had a question on skills from Tony Chapman, which Alex Meredith from RWE made a response. I'm seeing that there are 2 open questions. Is that, I can't see another one.
Yeah, so Tony's one has moved to answered because Alex has responded.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I've got the open one.
Yeah,
okay.
There we go. So he's looking at the workforce skills requirements to meet the needs of these. So I don't know if any of the other panelists want to chip in on that as well.
I just briefly, I can add something.
I'll let you go first, Matt.
All right, thanks, Sid. It's a piece of work that needs to be done, essentially, but it will be important. If you look at what's happening in 2 things by comparative for the UK sector deal, lots of work in skills and looking at how to embed, if you like, a sustainable career path within the UK, and that will need to apply to floating. And some of the lessons of what the sector deal is dealing with are about how some of that wasn't coordinated early on in the industry. In Scotland, those questions are being asked as well for developers, so you can, again, thinking about future schemes in South Wales, those issues will need to be resolved, and it comes about who you coordinate with to talk to local colleges, universities, etc. One of the challenges is timing. These are industries which are growth industries, but the jobs will be there, in small numbers at first, and then it will grow. So making sure you can start the long-term process via STEM work within schools to build up skill sets, etc. We have a UK-wide problem with lack of people coming through on STEM that we might need to resolve, particularly if you're looking at more rural communities where you want to embed opportunities for the local communities themselves and not just have an influx of labour. So a lot of issues there that will need good coordination by industry. Welsh Government particularly, with education a devolved issue, can have a big role to play in supporting that.
That's great, thank you, Matt. Just to read the question out in full for the attendees, because I'm conscious that they can't actually read it. So I had a question from Tony Chapman saying, fantastic to hear of the unprecedented rapid growth in the offshore energy sector. Can the panelists please talk about the expected workforce skills requirements to meet the needs of these projects? And if required, are there plans in place to ramp up education and training to grow local and national talent pools to meet the unique expertise requirements? So thanks for answering that, Alex and Matt. We've had another question then from Chris Martin saying, sort of to build on Tony's question, could you also identify the benefits to the local economy and supply chain? So Jess, you wanted to come in. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
So I was specifically going to mention the Swansea Bay City deal, which from a regional point of view is a significant opportunity from a skills and talent point of view. There is a specific training aspect to the Swansea Bay City deal. There's 11 projects included, and one of those hones in on skills and talent and upskilling individuals to deliver to the remaining 10 projects. So Marine Renewables obviously features within that already. As Marine Energy Wales, we have a coastal curriculum scheme that we roll out. We have a specific education manager who's actually going out into schools. We've succeeded in getting marine renewable energy into the Welsh Baccalaureate. So there's a section in there that is looking at that. So we have a focus on STEM and we are kind of bringing that through. From a supply chain point of view, then similarly tied into the Swansea Bay City deal. And I appreciate this is quite Swansea Bay centric. There are North Wales growth deals afoot, which will kind of look pan Wales. And we're working very closely with Welsh Government to understand the opportunities and the requirements from the sector across the board, and are expecting to gear up for a supply chain work package that we'll be working on with schemes such as Selkie and MEES that we've touched on already. So working with the Catapult to understand the Welsh requirement, and then kind of jigsawing that in with Welsh Government to try and deliver on that.
Yeah. Just to add to that as well, there's something I have to be really careful not to announce, but we're working on a very significant funding call that will be determined towards the end of the year into the tens of millions, and a particular focus of that emerging bid is around skills development. But again, I think at the moment we're looking at taking a slightly different tack, and I've seen it described as mission planning. So effectively understanding it, what we want to develop, where, what the scale is, and then matching skills against it, rather than necessarily looking at what's available in the education sector at the moment and trying to adapt it. Hopefully those things will meet nicely in the middle, but it's just a slightly different approach that we'll be kicking off, say, if all things go well next year.
Yeah, and just to finish off this short round of questioning, again picking up on Chris Martin's point about identifying the local benefits to the economy and supply chain, a very important part. Going back to what Jess said in her opening presentation, very much the focus of the Celtic Sea cluster from an industrial perspective will be looking to seek out and establish how those benefits can be delivered. So I would say to Chris that's very much work in progress. It will be a key focus for the development of the cluster, focused in this case on the cluster on the Celtic Sea. But I hope what we've done in this first opening session for this webinar is really give you, the attendees, a real taste for the scope and perspective that floating offshore wind offers us, and the fact that it is of huge interest to Wales. So I think I need to draw us back into time. We've been doing splendidly well. So I'd like to move now from that sort of general opening positioning piece, if for want of a better phrase, to talk more particularly now about specific developer interests and developments. So first of all, I would like to invite Alex Meredith from RWE Offshore Wind to give us an insight into RWE as a major energy player, their perspective and plans for Wales. So Alex, if I can pass over to you, please.
Thanks, Martin. Can you hear me all right? I've got the slides up. Hopefully you can see those as well.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Is that all right? Lovely. Thanks for having us, and thanks for hosting the session. And it's great to see such enthusiasm and attendance, and this topic really being taken on, full frontal, because it's a really exciting opportunity. So as Martin said, I'm from RWE Renewables. Just to sort of give you a little bit on RWE, which many of you I'm sure will have heard the name. RWE recently has gone through a bit of a transition and has brought together the Cian climate renewables business and what was Energy, and now is one of the largest producers of renewable energy in the world. And particularly significant for this conversation is number 2 developer in offshore wind globally. So we have a very large sort of presence and background and pedigree, I suppose, in offshore wind. And we can sort of look at the different numbers of different technologies. It's quite diverse. We have a lot of business all around the world. But most importantly for this conversation and for me personally, we have a great and proud history in Wales. And so, just looking at our portfolio in Wales, it's always a very important point to make in any of these conversations that whenever someone says Wales could be leading the world on X or Y, which we hear a lot of in different contexts, it's important to remember that Wales did have the first commercial scale offshore wind project in the UK, and that was built by RWE, North Hoyle, in 2004. And since then, we also built Real Flats and Gwynter Moor. And, we have ambitions to continue building fixed seabed sites off the coast of Wales. And some of you will have seen that we have just signed an agreement for lease for Awilmore Wind Farm, which is the extension of Gwynter Moor. But, beyond that, there's a real opportunity for development in Wales. And it does get me very excited. I'm based in Cardiff. I think some people on the call have already got a dose of my enthusiasm for this in the past. But the reality is we started in Wales, we did a lot of good work in Wales, and then a lot of the attention moved to the East Coast, mostly because the shallower depths and obviously the demand and the grid opportunities on the East Coast drove the industry in the UK in that direction, and leasing rounds kind of reflected that. But floating and the next phase really gives the West Coast and Wales particularly an opportunity to get back in the game and to start really developing an industry that could, well, could be 20, 30, 50 years, as the numbers that we've just seen show. So a really exciting time. And along with that, we have opportunities to develop hydrogen and, other kind of complementary technologies. So, the excitement is genuine, and the sea depths that we have and that have just been explained, potentially to access from Wales, put us in pole position. So that's a great opportunity. It's a long-term opportunity, and one that RWE are very keen to be central to exploiting. So just to give you a bit of a feel for our kind of technology position, I mean, RWE, as has been said, are a global leader in offshore wind, but we have been looking at floating for a long time. And we are, an energy developer, but we are really at heart an engineering company, and we have a real interest in the technology that's kind of behind the floating opportunities that we're seeing. So we have invested in a couple of different technologies, and I'll come to talk about those in a moment. But the general trajectory that we think we're going to see will be for the cost of the foundations and the cost of energy to be a crucial determinant of how this industry develops. And we say that because of our experience in fixed bottom wind, in that from a very early stage projects, the projects that we built in Wales, where there wasn't quite so much emphasis on cost, we will see a rapid move towards levelized cost of energy reductions, and auction processes which drive that kind of incentive are going to be part of our route to market. So we want to use the experience that we've had to ensure that we deliver cost-effective solutions in terms of technology. So we have a team in place. We're already working on projects, and the two that have been sort of publicized that I just wanted to sort of flag to people, and we can take questions and discuss any particular points of interest. I should say, and I should have said at the start, I'm not an engineer myself, so I come at this with clean hands, and I'll take any questions I can, but I'm not going to get into too much of the detailed technical specifications. But TetraSpar was our first investment in a floating wind technology. This is a collaboration between ourselves, Shell, and Steesdale Offshore Technologies. Some of you may recognize the name of Hendrik Steesdale, who was one of the pioneers of fixed bottom offshore wind with Siemens. Now this technology is we're developing as a sort of prototype and a demonstration in a fjord in Norway, expecting to be deployed early next year. And you can see here that this is this has got a keel system which effectively sits beneath the foundation, and that diagram doesn't really give you the proper scale, because that keel actually sits 60 meters beneath the yellow foundation piece, and so it's a very it's quite a big structure. It's suited to very deep water, and we think there are real opportunities for that around the world. I think the key point here, just to emphasize it, is that this technology has real potential in terms of cost, because it's made of tubular steel. And we think that there is, as I said earlier, a real need to look at designs that can be manufactured at scale and in a way which will drive down the cost of energy, as we think the industry will move in that direction. So we're not sure, obviously, yet. We haven't tested this fully, but this is an interesting innovation for certain depth conditions that we want to test out and see whether it will work. Moving on to the second project that we're doing, and this one is actually a legacy RWE project. So I come from the energy side of the business, and these two have come together. And again, this one is a concrete hull design, which so it's different, obviously, to TetraSpar. Doesn't sit so low in the water, and it's a barge technology that is one of the four main types of technology that we're seeing developed in the market. I'm sure others will have sort of more insights into the other types, but we're looking at this barge opportunity. It's in the it's being tested in Spain, and it will be giving us insights hopefully as to where we might look at slightly shallower depths potentially, because it doesn't have the deeper keel, or doesn't have a keel at all, and we're looking forward to getting the insights from that as it runs its test, which starts in 2022. So what does that mean for Wales? We see three challenges. So I suppose it's important to say we're technology agnostic. We're waiting to develop these tests and to see what the results show, and then seeing which sites are potentially the most attractive for which technologies, and moving forward on that basis. And Wales we think is a real opportunity, I said at the start, but it has three potential challenges. The first is leasing. Now clearly, the points that we've discussed in the first half about supply chain and skills and so on really are difficult to assess before we even have a leasing round that takes that provides an opportunity for projects to be developed in Welsh waters. So we need to see that round, and obviously the Celtic Sea is a real exciting opportunity in that sense, but we do need to make sure that happens in the short term. And short term in offshore wind is 5 to 7 years. So we need the Crown Estate to work to deliver that, and we need stakeholders, whether on this call or elsewhere, to help make sure that is the next step for the industry. In the meantime, we know that there's obviously a potential to develop smaller scale projects, and we're looking at sites. And I think, as was seen from the constraints map we saw earlier, there are opportunities off the Anglesey coast as well as in South Wales. And for us, we have a big operation in North Wales, and we know that area well. So it's interesting to us to look at that Anglesey opportunity. But equally, we have Pembroke Power Station, and there is a kind of good understanding of the grid issues in South Wales. So, there's potential to perhaps leverage either of those bases to try and deliver our first site in Welsh waters. I think it's important that, although we talk about the Celtic Sea very directly, and we're keen to see that development happen, there are opportunities in other parts of Welsh waters that, if the grid was developed in a certain way, we might see more development and opportunities arise. So something to think about there. But leasing certainly is the first barrier to delivery of a project. Secondly, and following from what I've just said, grid connection in Wales is problematic. I think anyone who works in renewables of any type will know this story. But to deliver the sort of capacities that have just been mentioned, it's just not achievable with the current grid infrastructure. And Wales needs to be rewired, completely. That includes distribution level, that community level, where we need decarbonisation of heat transport. There's an enormous challenge to bring the right sort of grid to people's homes. But for generators and developers like us, even capacity at the transmission level is not available for the sort of projects that are being foreseen at gigawatt scale. This will be compounded by potentially round 4 leasing in North Wales, which would potentially add more capacity to the grid in that area. But even in South Wales, I'll put the diagram here. You see on here voltage constraints and other constraints around the network, which are not going to be resolved in the short term. So I've sort of highlighted and we've talked a lot to government, Welsh government and UK government about this. But it's absolutely critical that we see investment in the grid network to allow for potentially development off South Wales and North Wales actually, but South Wales in particular. If this story is to really come true, there needs to be connection points made available. That is complicated by the role of Ofgem and UK government and non-devolved issues and so on. But we need to find solutions here and start making that investment now. And the third challenge and the final thing, I wanted to flag was, just making sure that we have the right regulatory regime and the ability to deliver, consents and licenses in a timescale that works for projects. And so, I've mentioned here, there are some, question marks still as we haven't yet gone through a process of consenting an offshore wind project in Wales under the devolved powers. And the innovation scale projects may be the first to do that. But in the meantime, there's also marine licensing to be managed by Natural Resources Wales. And in the context of other schemes, we've seen challenges to deliver those on time. Now, we as a company are working with Natural Resources Wales to sort of address that, and we will continue to, and we want to bring all the knowledge that we've got from our experience to help and ensure that we have the right approach to consenting and licensing in Wales to make sure it remains an attractive place to develop. But clearly in our project risk registers, this kind of issue does sort of feature, and something that we all want to work together to resolve. So that was my sort of starter for 10 on where we are in Wales. As I say, extremely exciting opportunity, a long-term process, but challenges that we need to address as well through leasing, grid and consenting.
Alex, thank you so much. Really interesting insight from a major player, as you say. We're going to move on now to have a look at some specific technology, and specifically wind float from Principal Power. So very warm welcome to Cian Conroy from Principal Power, who will talk to us about some of the work that Principal Power have done and are doing in this sector at the moment. So Cian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Perfect. So I suppose thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'd really like just kind of give an overview of the technology that we're using in Principal Power and that we've developed. I suppose give some insight into the projects, how they're built, how they're deployed, and I think finally there's the opportunity that floating wind can create for Wales. So I think going back to the topic, floating wind driving the green recovery. So by background to the company, Principal Power was founded back in 2007 in Berkeley in California. Since then, we've expanded around the world. Our most recent offices open in Japan. We have offices in California, Portugal, France, and now Japan. We are backed by large utilities in the electricity market, but also significant players in the oil and gas sector and also in the domestic gas provision in Japan. We've developed and patented the wind flow technology, and that's probably the key bit of the presentation. And I suppose the topic today is the pipeline and how that drives forward our project. So I'll cover off that. So some key highlights. The wind float, we currently have 4 wind floats installed. 3 of those units are installed in Portugal, and a 4th is in the UK off the east coast of Stonehaven. We have 11 wind floats in active design and construction. We have produced over 25 gigawatt hours of electricity. The largest turbine we're working with, we're currently constructing for the French project using the 10 megawatt turbine. So that will be deployed in 2022 as the largest turbine on a floating structure. Our units have been deployed and survived perfectly in 17 meter wave swells, and the maximum wind we've encountered is 41 meters per second. So I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that after that list is that it's gone through the demonstration phase and we're now working towards commercial projects, and that's really the key piece. In terms of the wind float itself, just some of the key attributes of it. So we see here is our wind float 1, which was our demonstration project. The wind float itself, it has a relatively shallow draft. So as a semi-submersible, this enables a number of key advantages. It can be deployed from relatively shallow ports. It doesn't need fjords or as other devices might. It can be towed back to shore and maintained in relatively shallow ports. The structure itself is its own installation vessel. It's inherently stable in transit, so it's towed there by a standard tug. We use standard quayside assembly and commissioning. So again, this allows us to use infrastructure that exists. We don't need to tailor it. So we can use shipyards and harbours. The platform itself is turbine agnostic. So we've always taken the decision that the choice of turbine will be made by the site developer rather than by the platform developer. So we've had certification in principle from the 3 leading OEMs. We've also been certified for downwind turbines for projects in Japan. So we really see that as being a decision by the customer. So to go back to Megan's point, we do interface with the turbines, but on the turbine control, we don't require too much input from the turbine. We rely on sort of the SCADA data to tell us what the turbine is doing, and the platform responds in kind. We don't control the turbine itself. The system itself provides a number of other advantages in terms of its stability. So we get to use low tension conventional moorings. So projects to date, it's continuing mooring spreads with a drag embedment anchor. And then finally, again, so touching on some of the points that was raised in the research projects, we see connection and disconnection as a key attribute of floating wind. So the ability to isolate the turbine and tow it back to shore for any remedial actions that are required. So if we see a blade repair or blade exchange required or a gearbox. The wind float itself has a patented quick connection system which runs at 66 kV. So it enables us to isolate a platform, disconnect it, keep the string energized, and tow the removed platform back to port. We see here in kind of greater detail in the schematic the wind float itself. So you'll see sort of the 4 main attributes. The A we have identified as what's called the hull trim system, and this is used after high energy events to bring the platform back into trim. So we can move ballast between the 3 columns to bring the platform back into a horizontal. This is a closed loop system, so we don't bring in water from the outside environment. It's the water that's there permanently. Very often people refer to this as a sort of an active ballast system, but I think in reality it's the trim system. So when we saw in our first deployed unit, on an average basis, the pumps themselves are only running for about between 45 minutes and an hour in a 24-hour period. So it's not operating in a dynamic response to the turbine. The second feature we have here is our static water ballast. So these are the ballast tanks to achieve operational draft. This enables us to use greater flexibility in our marine operations. So we can adjust the ballast during the commissioning of a quayside. We can then enable different ballasts for towing, and then a final to achieve our operational ballast at the installed port. We've seen kind of examples of where adjusting the draft is key. Our project in Scotland, we commissioned in Dundee. We had to overcome a sandbank at the entrance to the Tay, so we adjusted our towing ballast using the static water ballast and the use of ballast bags themselves to raise our operational draft for towing to port. As I mentioned already, the platform itself is turbine agnostic, so we can work with any of the turbines themselves. And then finally is the heave plates. So these are what's very often referred to as water entrapment plates. These are a crucial and patented element of the wind float itself. And what they're really using there is the viscous damping of the water. So in response to the thrust on the turbine, the damping effect itself is providing the stability for the platform. So these 3 elements together enable us to use the low tension spread on the moorings, which then has other impacts on ROV usage for hookups and connection and so on. So when we go towards commercial scale projects, the 3 kind of key elements that we look at in terms of commercial projects is the survivability of the platform. Will it actually produce electricity for 25 years? Is it investable? And the industrialization approach to it. So I'll talk a small bit about each of those. So in terms of survivability, you see our first WindFloat 1 deployed off the coast of Portugal. Here we see it surviving 17 meter swells during its operational life. So that was deployed from 2011 to 2016 for a 5-year EU demonstration project. In the bottom right, we see the power curve for the turbine. So the turbine used on that was a standard Vestas D80. And this graph was shown is the production curve of a standard onshore V80 mapped against the production of the floating V80. So we see like for like that we're getting the same curve and sort of no variation in that in the platform. And I suppose the third bit is industrialization. How do we ramp up demand? I think one of the questions earlier was talking about industrialization and the demand that would create. The wind float is designed to be fabricated in a number of environments, whether it's using dry docks, as we see here, or using quayside facilities. It can be adapted to be manufactured in multiple environments. So briefly, Windfloat 1, this was our demonstration project. So we deployed this in 2011, just off the coast of Portugal. It was a 5-year EU-funded demonstration project. We used an off-the-shelf Vestas V80 with minimal interface with the turbine, no control requirements. We operated in 1 meter return periods of 7 meters HS. As I said, intense storms of 17 meters. And what was crucial in all of this was the project itself was a 5-year end-to-end project. So it was to prove the viability of off-site construction and commissioning, the tow to port, and crucially the operations and maintenance. So far, the decommissioning of the project, we ran it as a O&M exercise, so that the turbine was returned to port to replicate and to sort of run a scenario for blade exchange, nacelle exchange, gearbox exchange, so we could prove the viability of these activities in a port location. And quickly, I just touch on some of the key points. I think Matt referred to known projects in his breakdown of offshore projects globally. So I'll just very quickly talk through the projects that we have under contract. I would sort of caveat that there's far more projects cooking away in the background, and I think what we'll see in the next 5 to 6 years is more and more of these projects come out at various locations around the UK and the world, whether these be standalone floating projects or hybrid projects which are bolted onto existing fixed wind farms. So the first project you may have seen in the press last week is our Windfloat Atlantic. This is a 25 megawatt, 3-unit project deployed off the west coast of Portugal. So we achieved commercial operations in 2019. Full production was delayed primarily due to COVID. So we overcame that, and that's now fully operational as of last week. And again, in turbine size, this project is using the largest turbines of their type on a floating structure. It's the 8.3 Vestas V164. And again, it's all operating as expected. It's the second floating wind farm globally, so we're the first to use semi-subs, and it's, I suppose, the largest floating turbine installed offshore. And crucially, it's the first floating project to have bank financing. I won't go into too much of the details, but I suppose just a key point is it's certified. The certification process comes up as a query. The platform itself in this project was certified by ABS, whilst the turbines and the inter-array cables were certified by DNV-GL. So we can see 2 of the units being fabricated in Lisnave, the shipyard on the west coast of Portugal. The 3rd unit was made off-site on a fabrication yard in Spain. And here we see the commissioning of the project. So this happened at the Outer Berth in Fene in Barrow. The 3 platforms were brought together, fully constructed, where the turbine was installed and commissioned using onshore crawler cranes. So a point that was raised in the question is the need for heavy lift. In this scenario, we're able to adapt and use existing onshore crawlers to commission the turbine in a more controlled environment. So the tower's installed in quayside, as is the nacelle and blades. And then we use standard tugs to bring it offshore. And here's, if this video works, you will see some of the operations from the start of the year when we had 2 of the units installed. Is the CCTV footage showing the Atlantic conditions for floating platforms. The next project we're working on is closer to home in the UK, and this is the Kincardine 50 megawatt project. So we will be looking for an operation date this year, so installation is due to start this summer. When operational, this will be the world's largest floating wind farm at 50 megawatts. It will be made up of 2 classes of turbines. We have the 2 megawatt Vestas V80, which was previously deployed in Scotland, has been repurposed and deployed in previously deployed in Portugal, I should say, is now deployed in Scotland. And from this summer, it will be joined by 5 9.5 megawatt Vestas turbines, so a total capacity of 50 megawatts. The project itself, I think, really is the first to start looking at the industrialization approach. So how do you start getting 5 units installed in a short period? From fabrication, it's a 12-month project to the fabrication yard, so we're starting to see acceleration in the numbers of units per year. We'll see acceleration in the speed of turbines installed. And I think crucially from an industry, this is on track to be the first to use non-recourse project finance. The third project that is under construction is the EFGL project in France. So this is one of 4 demonstration projects being run by the French government. The platform here being deployed off the Mediterranean coast, so a variation in the sea states from our other North Sea and Atlantic conditions. It's 18 kilometers offshore with water depths varying from 70 to 100 meters. And this platform will be using the 10 megawatt turbine. So as I said, it'll be the largest turbines deployed offshore for floating platforms. And when we get to this stage, this is really the generation 3 of the wind float. So this has been designed from the ground up for reducing the weight, improving the manufacturability in terms of weld times and connection times, but also accelerating the industrial development. So it'll be a key project as we kind of finish the need for demonstrations. I think our view on the world now is that we've proved the viability in all of the sea states, we've proven the ability to manufacture, and now it's really about driving down costs, and that's really been driven through industrialization. So just to cover up again on the variation, this project itself is certified by Bureau Veritas for the French market. The last slide I'll show here to be quite quick, and I think this was just really talking about the green economy, and I'll touch on the question on skills here if I can, but I suppose really when we look at floating wind, the floating wind isn't creating a new market, it's bringing together existing markets and existing supply chains and increasing the scale of them. So floating wind will increase the entire market for offshore. So where we've seen successes in the UK for the fixed wind sector and the successes of the sector deal, they will be transferred furthermore into the floating sector. So it's not an either or scenario. So we see projects like the success of Mitsubishi MVAW, Mitsubishi Vestas in the UK and their Isle of Wight facility. The blades that we use for the Windfloat Atlantic were manufactured in the UK. So we'll start to see more and more market for the successes that are there. We'll see diversification of the oil and gas sector. So we've started already, the Windfloat itself has come from the oil and gas sector. A lot of our pedigree as a company comes from that, and a lot of our supply chain comes across from the oil and gas. We see companies like JDR who have developed the connection system, which is a fast connect system for the mooring lines to the platform itself. So if you look at the most recent videos on YouTube, you'll see that being pulled through. First Subsea and Hartlepool have developed the floating dynamic inter-array cable. And again, what was once an oil and gas company have developing umbilicals, have diversified into fixed wind, and now more recently into floating. And I think the third element that's crucial in all this is the onshore installation and commissioning work, where we see markets like Wales that have significant onshore wind. We can start to see that capability transferred to the offshore environment, and that'll really be used in the floating sector. You know, when we see crawler cranes commissioning at the quayside, it's very similar work to what has already happened in the large onshore wind farms. So it starts to open up more opportunities for the supply chain. So there's sort of 3 distinct markets within that. But I think the same is true of skills. When we look to the skills requirement, we see Principal Power as a company, we look to the fixed wind sector to our staff. So where there are processes in place, I think they'll need to be adapted and tailored for floating wind. Similarly for oil and gas, a lot of our technicians offshore have come from the oil and gas sector, and it's just a recalibration of their skills rather than starting from zero. But I think it's that migration and how we can efficiently migrate staff from oil and gas to renewables, and then similarly from the onshore and offshore side. The other area I think we can look to for a lot of supply is areas such as the Royal Navy. Some of our technicians have already come from the Royal Navy and had that experience of working offshore in extreme environments and bring a key attribute to the sector. So what we have here is an opportunity to slowly migrate the staff that are there. But as the point that was made earlier on, as we ramp towards 70 gigawatts, the projects themselves will drive the growth in the supply chain and the skills. So as we ramp up from demonstration to commercial, that's when we'll start to see more and more activity in the supply chain, and that's when the skills themselves will start to migrate across. So I kind of rattled through that very quickly, just to get back on track, but I hope that adds a little bit of flavor to the projects and what we do. And that's my contact details if anyone would like to follow up with me directly. Thank you.
Cian, thank you so much. Really gives an insight into what is actually happening in the industry right now, in terms of, I suppose, the pioneering steps with delivery to go on top of the opportunity that we've heard about. So thank you for that. So looking to future and hopefully imminent project development, I'd like to invite now David Jones and Christoph Harwood from Blue Wind and Simply Blue Energy to talk to us about the Erebus project specifically. So, Christoph, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Can you see the screen, the slides?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay, diolch yn fawr iawn am a couple of siarad heddiw. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have a chat to you this afternoon. And yeah, Christoph and I am really pleased that we've been given the opportunity to talk to you about Wales's first floating offshore wind farm in the Celtic Sea. So just very briefly, a little bit about Simply Blue Energy, founded in 2011. A real view of sustainable opportunities in the blue economy. Currently a team of around 20, actively recruiting with offices in Cork, Edinburgh, Cornwall and now Pembroke. And you'll hear a little bit more about the joint venture with Total for floating wind in the Celtic Sea, but also still have an interest in wave technology and working with Core Power on South Wales, UK and Irish sites, and also a sustainable approach to aquaculture as well. Apologies from Vanessa. She heads up UK Wind for Total. She's on school holidays at the moment, so I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, apart from to say that the objective from Total is to own 25 gigawatts of gross installed renewable capacity by 2025. So primarily for them, solar and wind, obviously coming into fixed offshore wind and now floating offshore wind as well. So real move by Total into this market. And for us, we see success through partnerships and collaboration, and the way we do that is early mover advantage, identifying sites and doing some de-risking and then going out to the market. And when we went to the market in March 2020, or slightly before that, Total and a number of, there was real market interest in floating technology and floating technology in the Celtic Sea as well. But in March 2020, the announcement was made and the joint venture of Blue Wind between Simply Blue Energy and Total. It's an 80%, 20% mix, and you can see the vision there. It's about creating a new low carbon offshore energy sector in the Celtic Sea, contributes to climate change targets and provides those high skilled jobs. And we've heard quite a bit about this as well in terms of supply chain diversification from oil and gas and other sectors as well. And importantly, I think moving forward, energy security as well at a UK level. What we're really keen on is a stepping stone strategy. We feel, and I know Alex talked about that before as well, from RWE's perspective, and that's great to hear. We do feel that will allow the development of the supply chain content being maximised. If we start with the smaller projects and work up to commercial scales, that's where we can see real benefit for local supply chain companies. So the joint venture is working on a 96 megawatt demonstration project, which I'll talk to you a little bit in a bit more detail now, called Erebus. But I think it's fair to say as well, as a joint venture, we are looking at another pre-commercial project of circa 300 megawatts out in the Celtic Sea, and there is interest from Total and others as well at a 500 megawatt commercial opportunities, probably moving into the 2030s. But again, a nod to Alex's point before about the Crown Estate going to play a critical role in that. So a little bit about our project and a little bit about floating wind. Apologies if you didn't quite see all of those icons. I've just last minute taken them from our website. But from an Erebus perspective, 45 kilometres offshore, significantly reducing visual impact. Our sea surface for our floating platforms and turbines is about approximately 32 kilometres or less. That is 0.02% of the Celtic Sea. In terms of sea space, we're looking at between 7 and 10 platforms, and that will depend on the turbine size and obviously working closely with Cian and Principal Power Inc. Going offshore, 80% of the world's wind resources in deeper water than 60 meters. It is a market that I believe will come on really quickly. And then from Erebus, delivering the Celtic Sea's first offshore floating wind project, reducing carbon emissions, providing green energy to 89,000 homes, and this whole sustainable coastal communities, I think, is really important. And I think this is a figure that's been talked about briefly. But the first gigawatt floating wind in the Celtic Sea, delivering over 3,000 jobs and almost 700 million in local supply chain opportunities by 2030. That is for Wales and the southwest as well. And as I mentioned, just that less visual impact as we move further offshore. I debated internally whether to actually show this photo montage. You are, in ideal conditions, you are supposed to print this out at a certain size and put it on a table 50 centimeters away. Obviously, I can't do that digitally, but I also quite like the idea of about 90 people really getting close to their computer monitors. So that is an array, and that is 45 kilometers offshore. That is based on a GE turbine on a principal power platform, 45 kilometers for shore. There is a slight visual impact, but it's very, 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 very minimal. This is taken at beach level on probably a perfect day in Pembrokeshire, I'd suggest, the best visibility you could possibly get. Something else I think is really important, and I know, all the way from MAF at the beginning we touched on this, is that fixed offshore, it's been really successful for North Wales, and Alex has talked about that, but more recently, I think the northeast of England have benefited incredibly from the success of fixed offshore wind. We absolutely need it for our low carbon targets. But if you look at Cambridge Economics suggestions out to 2032, and the job creation is generally on the northeast coast, and we're not seeing that benefit in the southwest too much, I think it's fair to say. So it's really important in terms of extending those economic benefits, and also I think the Celtic Sea will bring some energy system benefits as well. So yeah, really, really important there. A little bit more about the project. We have secured grid. Really pleased to say we are very, very close to a site option agreement from the Crown Estate, and working closely with them. We'd expect an announcement in the next 4 weeks. We began survey work actually all the way in 2019, so working to a 2021 EIA completion, and really working hard towards that CFD auction round of 2023. That's one of the drivers for us, and then start of generation by 2027. 2027 seems like a long time away when you look at it on a slide and a table, but we've got a very challenging program. It's incredibly busy, and there's a lot to do, and lots of targets and milestones to hit as well. We're working very closely with PPI. They will be providing the platforms for Erebus, and the turbine will be decided by the market in due course. But just a couple of images I think that Cian perhaps didn't show. I was deleting some of mine as he was going through his presentation. But yeah, just so you appreciate the scale, I think, of the platforms, the opportunity, and perhaps the fact you get sunnier blue skies in Spain as well is something to be considered. But yeah, the wind floats being towed out from port, and just, I think just that I think shows an appreciation of the scale that we're talking about, just in terms of the size of the mooring chains required to deliver these projects. This came from the Catapult study. I know it's been talked about today, and again, this isn't based on any detailed design that we've done or work that Principal Power Inc. have done as yet, but it just captures the supply chain and that stepping stone approach, and what it could look like in terms of array cables, mooring chain mass, anchor mass, based on Erebus, moving to a 300 megawatt project, and then out to a more commercial size opportunity. So an update from us, really working closely with the Celtic Sea Alliance, the Celtic Sea Cluster that's already been mentioned, MEW, Cornwall bodies and development agencies in Cornwall as well. We've delivered a port study that was to build up engagement and understanding, but also stimulate upgrades. And I think the ports have an absolutely critical role to play at a UK government level in terms of supply chain content. I think if we can nestle some of the opportunities within the ports around the UK, I think that will have a positive impact on the supply chains that surround ports. So really important. I think upgrades are really required at a UK government level, and it's really good news that Pembroke Dock Marine has been signed off, and there is finance available to do that. Something else that we've been working on is work at a Celtic Sea level. We looked at the resource, but also system benefits as well. And perhaps Christoph may touch upon this later, but we've identified that the benefits of our systems, because we have different wave and different wind patterns in the Celtic Sea versus the North Sea as well. So potentially some system benefits there. Building the Blue Gem Wind team across Celtic Sea offices, the head office is in Pembroke for the project, but the team are in Cornwall. The team are over in Cork, the team are up in Scotland, and the Total team are in Paris and London as well, so spread around. Just high-level timescales, site selection, that's complete. I also wanted to touch on some of the contracts that we've awarded to date. So there's 9 contracts involved in site selection. We did start consenting in site selection slightly, if you like. So probably started consenting around about 2019, but we see that going out to 24, 13 contracts let to date. Project design, 2020 to 2024. OWC, principal designers for us, and obviously working closely with Principal Power Inc. as well in terms of delivering the platforms, working out to installation and commissioning 26, 27, generation 27, O&M all the way out to 2052. And again, that's a real opportunity, I think, for the Southwest is O&M and over the lifetime of these projects, which is 25 years plus as well. And interestingly, thinking about decommissioning now in 2052. But delighted to say, so far to date, with the round about 10 million plus contracts that we've let, we've seen 85% UK content. So really, really pleased to announce that as well. So yeah, important moving forward. I think that's certainly one of the strengths at the UK level is the design and the project development of wind. And the next steps for us, we are starting offshore surveys this month actually. So boats and notice to mariners and all of that exciting stuff is happening now. Obviously starting a Met Ocean campaign, floating lidars, etc. out on the site. Obviously started consenting, but again, important for us to start to reach out to coastal communities now and stakeholders and start to think about running events as part of our statutory approach to EIAs. Onshore design, doing a lot around the cable route and potential substation build, obviously going into Pembroke Power Station and had some really good relationships and conversations with RWE there. And again, I think we need a bit more detail now. We're working with Principal Power Inc. to deliver this around the port requirements. What are they, and where can the UK ports play a role, and what infrastructure upgrades could be required to do that. And then for us, stakeholder engagement incredibly important. So it's challenging under COVID, reaching out to communities, but we're going to have to be innovative. I think the way we do that, and think about how we deliver that. Working with development agencies. I know we've talked about education and skills throughout the afternoon. We've already sat down with Pembrokeshire College, for example, and given them some ideas around the skills moving forward as well. And the one thing I wanted to just mention briefly before handing over to Christoph to finish us off is that we are launching our online supply chain database today. So that's gone live. So all supply chain companies on the call and beyond, we would really, really want you to go onto the Blue Gem Wind website and over to the contact us page and join our supply chain database. You'll see project high level timelines there, but then that gives you the opportunity to for you to go in and tell us which phases of your project are you experienced in. Is it design, consenting, EPC, decommissioning, and then it drills down into all the skills. And we ask for a capability statement as well, and that will help us build up an online supply chain database, which will be relevant for the opportunities moving forward. So thank you, Martin. I'm going to hand over to Christoph now, if that's okay. I think I'm going to continue to drive the slides, and Christoph can provide the narrative.
Great, thanks, David. Just wanted to build on that. David is part of Blue Gem Wind, which is Simply Blue's joint venture with Total. So I'm just going to tell a little bit of the broader story, only 4 slides, about what we're doing as Simply Blue Energy beyond Blue Gem Wind, and also just think a bit about the future of the Celtic Sea. We had Neil earlier from the Catapult talking about the capacity. This was a report also done by ITP Energize, which we shared with everybody about a year ago now. And it really looked at the capacity of the Celtic Sea as between 150 and 250 gigawatts of available power. Now, we've been advised not to use the whole number, but to work on 20% of, say, 50 gigawatts, which aligns with some of the work you also saw presented by Neil. And I think the important thing is, rather than me dwelling on each zone, is there's a lot of wind out there. And the question is, what do we do with it? How do we access it? And how do we get it to market? So if we go to the next slide, and really one of the things I think we need to do collectively as an industry, as companies interested in the Celtic Sea, is think about it. One of the important things is the wind blows at different times in the Celtic Sea compared to the North Sea. And that clearly is important when you start looking at grid balancing across the whole of the UK in a low carbon environment. It's a new piece of work. We commissioned it at the beginning of this year. We've shared it with the Committee of Climate Change, and we've shared it with BEIS and others, because one of the values the Celtic Sea can bring to the whole of the UK is this asynchronous production. And I think it's something that we will look into more detail as time progresses. The other thing is, as Neil again also covered, is there's a lot of power there, actually more power than we currently need in Wales or in Ireland itself, or perhaps across some of the UK. So what is the future for the hydrogen economy? What is the future for interconnectors? These are questions that interest us strategically. We are working on today's floating wind farms, but we want to create a lot of power in the Celtic Sea, and we've got to look at a route to market. So just waving a flag for this now, and hopefully it'll be something that we will discuss in the months and years to come. David. What we're doing is simply blue energy off Milford Haven in the Celtic Sea. You will see that we've been talking about Blue Gem Wind, and that's the project where we're very much focused in on at the moment with the Erebus project, 96 megawatts. However, we have been talking to Wave Hub for a number of years now. We initially actually started there talking to them about wave energy, and then have now been talking to them about switching that site across to floating wind. As you will know from the press, they are in the market at the moment. So maybe that will be a floating wind site coming through in the next couple of years. But importantly, we're also south of Ireland. You will again seen in the press that we have put in to review the site opportunities off Kinsale in South Ireland, and that could be up to 1 gigawatt there. And I think the important thing about this chart and what it says is that the Celtic Sea has a lot of opportunities, but it's also cross-border, and we're hoping that we can all see this in a world of the post-Brexit world that we are in and are moving into further, is that there can be cooperation for supply chain, for economic development in both Irish and UK waters of the Celtic Sea. And as a company that is based in Cork, have offices in Pembroke Dock and down in Newquay, you can see why we are attracted to the Celtic Sea and looking for a lot of cooperation. And you know, we're delighted that Marine Energy Wales is leading the Celtic Sea Alliance on this. However, if we go to the next slide, just want to leave you with some policy issues, because hopefully all of you are aware of the value of floating wind, but of course we do need the politicians, we do need policy to be right to keep this going. And the Celtic Sea does raise some issues outside the world of the North Sea. If you were sitting in bays in Westminster 2 years ago, you probably wouldn't have heard of the Celtic Sea, and you would be looking for a map to understand it better. But what you are saying now is the Celtic Sea opportunity creates some policy challenges. The report on the left was a report done by our UK and Scottish Renewables last year, and it basically said there are 3 key challenges, and I've added on the 4th one, which is not a surprise to anyone. So the first one is we need revenue support. We need revenue support through the CFD system. And the point about this is actually the first projects we believe in floating wind in the CFD system will be from the Celtic Sea. ScotWind, as far as we can tell, of course there's always 1 or 2 hidden things going on in the market, but as far as we can tell, ScotWind will not be ready to at least 2025, if not 2027 CFD rounds. And therefore, with Erebus looking for the 2023 CFD round, we believe we will be one of the first going through the CFD system, but of course there is also Wave Hub who has those aspirations as well. Secondly, on the pipeline of projects, that is critical. ScotWind is putting in 5 gigawatts of floating wind. In the Celtic Sea, at the moment, the only way you can do floating wind in the Celtic Sea is a 100 megawatt test and demonstration project as leased by the Crown Estate. There is no other process in place to do more than that. For the supply chain that is looking to grow and develop on the back of floating wind, we clearly need to move from a single project such as ours, or a couple of others, as PDZ and Wave Hub, but we need to increase the size and the scope of the supply chain, sorry, of the pipeline of projects. Third issue identified in the report is around infrastructure and supply chain. The issue for the Celtic Sea, as I see it, is there isn't the oil and gas sector legacy that we see in Scotland. If you go to Aberdeen, if you go up to Peterhead, if you go around that area, you can see there's a lot of subsea capability, there's a lot of supply chain capability. We don't have that history in the Celtic Sea, and therefore, we are encouraging everybody to think about these things now, so that investment can be made in time to deliver the pipeline of projects. The UK government has a target of a 60% UK content by 2030. We would argue that by going early with stepping stone projects, there is a greater chance of achieving that objective within the Celtic Sea, hence stepping stone projects. And finally, as Alex mentioned, grid is always on everybody's mind. Grid for the 2020s, yes, important, but actually grid for the 2030s. We really need to see a lot of investment in time and effort, and eventually money, in upgrading the grid for the Celtic Sea, so we can get that power away into the market, into the UK, into Ireland, and also, frankly, into the continent for interconnectors. So just ending really on that is lots happening on floating wind, but any of you who meets an MP, sees an MP, writes to an MP, remind them that they've still got quite a lot of work to do. Thank you.
David and Christoph, thank you very much for that really interesting focus on developments off the south coast of Wales there. Okay, we have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. So I'll go to the Q&A the box on our screens at the moment. Hoping that you can see these questions. If you can't, I'll just make sure that you understand what the questions are. And let me go back to one from Colin Hardy initially, and perhaps Cian or other developers can give an insight into this, or perhaps Megan from Carbon Trust. Question is, given the overwhelming success of float out and install jackup in North Sea oil, why is this being overlooked, especially with turbines getting much bigger and therefore not needing specialist installation vessels and offshore cranes? That was a point made by Megan and some of the work that's going on with Carbon Trust studies. Anybody like to come in on that, please?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I think so the report that we did, it goes into more detail on it, but I don't think the conclusion was that there's no place for it. The conclusion was that it needs to be specifically demonstrated and tested, just like any new technology, really. The jackups and the sort of offshore cranes have been used for decades, whereas the sort of self-installing side of things is relatively new. So we just need to be mindful of the fact that those areas need to be sort of demonstrated specifically in those technologies.
Thanks, Megan. Cian, I don't know whether, given your experience with WindFloat, whether there is, you'd like to make any comment about that?
Well, I wouldn't comment on other technologies, but what I would say is that the WindFloat itself has come from the oil and gas sector. It was developed as an auxiliary platform for the production in the oil and gas. And when we look at the vast majority of structures used in the oil and gas sector, I think 80% of them are semi-submersible. So I think that's just really where our lineage comes from, is the oil and gas sector and the use of semi-subs in that area. But I wouldn't have a specific view on a different technology, but we do use self-installing vessels and so on for that.
Okay, thanks, Cian. And coming back to you again, Dilys Howells has also raised a question about where you have manufactured your floating devices. I think we saw some of that in the presentation, but perhaps you'd like to confirm that and maybe talk about it in the context of the Erebus project.
Yeah, so I think there's two questions there from Dilys. I'll roll the two into one. So the projects to date have been fabrication and final assembly at yards in Spain and Portugal, quite close where the projects are. But then also there's quite a wide supply chain that feeds into that. So we have, as I say, the blades come from the Isle of Wight, or cables come from Hartlepool. So the supply chain itself is quite geographically spread. As I said, the final fabrication has just been, one yard it was on a quayside, and the other it was on a dry dock, just depending on the availability of yards and fabricators. The issue of opportunities in Wales, David touched on, we'll be working quite closely with the Erebus team to maximise the potential. And our team of engineers are working in the background as we speak on both the port side of things and also on the supply chain opportunities.
Thanks.
So I'd encourage you to register on the supplier database with David.
Yeah, thanks, Cian. Thank you very much. Anybody else before I move on would like to contribute to that? No? Okay. So Dilys has asked another question, and I suppose this is specifically about Pembroke Port. We haven't got a panelist from Pembroke Port from Milford Haven involved directly, but the question in relation to the upgrade at Pembroke Port, will it be sufficient for it to play a significant role in developing the Erebus project? I may be speaking out of turn here, but given the output from the Swansea Bay City deal, certainly the development of the infrastructure in Pembroke Port will be taking into account the opportunity for floating offshore wind. I'm sure, Chris Martin has been and may still be on the call, but from the port. So perhaps this is a question that we can address at another future event. And I would say it's absolutely clear to me that the supply chain questions and supply chain participation in the event is very high. We plan certainly to do a future webinar specifically looking at the supply chain, the diversification opportunities, and the engagement for the supply chain with industry. David has given us and introduced to us today the launch of the Erebus and Blue Gem Wind's supply chain database. So I think things are really starting to take off, and we will make sure that what we can try and do is bring to you progress in the industry as we progress. I see Chris has come up with a comment there. We are keen to be a key strategic partner and working with colleagues to understand the future requirements. So I think we are seeing things moving apace. Welsh Government are certainly moving forward with analyses on grid and ports, all to do with supporting the offshore industry per se across Wales. So I would say there is an awful lot going on.
Martin, I was just going to add. Yeah, just going to add. I can't answer Dilys's question, but we've been a really good close working relationship with the port. They've been incredibly open and incredibly supportive to date in terms of future planning, and we would expect the city deal to make a difference, but we won't fully know until probably the weeks and months ahead when there's more detailed engineering design being carried out.
Okay. And Cian, I don't know whether you want to comment on this yet, but there is, we shouldn't always think everything is going to go to one port. There are a number of ports around the Celtic Sea where there are opportunities, and it is good from a project point of view to look at a number of different locations. So Pembroke, clearly, David looks out of his office window and looks down on the port, but there are other ports around the Celtic Sea. And if we're doing 8 platforms in Erebus, which is a sort of working number at the moment, then we might see that workload spread a bit.
Agreed. The Windflow Atlantic used 3 different facilities, two during fabrication and a third during commissioning, for a 3-unit project. So there's no reason that the same logic wouldn't, and that's part of the studies really that are ongoing at the moment.
Yeah, probably a decentralized port strategy, Martin, I think overall.
Well, I think the scope of the requirement is going to demand that's necessary. It's just too big for any one port, and that comes back full circle again to the development of the Celtic Sea cluster, and really adding the capabilities and the resources and the infrastructure in Wales to expertise and skill sets which may be complementary from Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, specifically to thinking about the Celtic Sea. Alex Meredith talked at length about the skill sets and the work that has already been done in North Wales in fixed bottom offshore wind. It really is a question of bringing this all together, and certainly from our engagement as MEW with Welsh Government, I'm convinced that the Welsh Government is recognising these opportunities and really is set on bringing them to the fore. So I can say that absolutely this is work in progress.
And Martin, can I just add one point? You talked about the challenge of doing 8 platforms for Erebus. If you went to a 300 megawatt site, that would be 24 platforms.
Yeah.
If you went to a gigawatt site, which we should be targeting in the 2030s, you know, you're talking about 50, 60, 70, depending on the size of the turbine. So this is why we believe stepping stone projects should start small, but we should be very clear in our minds that the end game is to take gigawatts of power out of the Celtic Sea, which will require, I can't remember how many platforms Neil had in his one, but he had an awful lot of platforms being deployed in the Celtic Sea. And we want to capture as much of that value as we can in the ports area and the shipyards that surround the sea. Okay,
thank you. Just before we finished, there was a question earlier from really related to the first session, or from the first session, which we ran out of time in terms of addressing. It's from Joe Lewis, where she raised the question. Megan said that more floating heavy lift vessels were needed in order to progress. Would the construction of these vessels potentially be in the UK or further afield? Could a shortage of these vessels significantly hold back the Celtic Sea and UK flow developments? Megan?
Yes. So I think traditionally we haven't seen those sorts of vessels being constructed in Wales, but obviously that would be something that would massively contribute to the local supply chain. In terms of the sort of constraint to wind development, I mean, in fixed wind, even we've seen that you know, the limit of vessel availability has caused a headache, and that's certainly something that the industry has responded to there, and I would expect it to for this. You know, for this technology as well. You know, we just need to make sure that the response is the most cost-effective solution and actually meets the needs of the industry as well.
Thanks, Megan. I think Math, you wanted to, or were suggesting you could add to this response.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, I mean, it was said by a number of people, but there are different approaches in floating offshore wind, and we'll work out what is best as we develop. And as Christoph was saying, we have an opportunity to use early projects to learn. And we should think about the scale of this opportunity. This isn't a few small projects. This is a very, very large industry coming to the UK, and there will be supply chain benefits across the whole of the UK, and of course in Wales. And there are opportunities. We can manage some of the constraints that we've had in fixed offshore wind, where the vessel providers tend to be from the continent. There's a lot of different ways of building out floating offshore wind, including a lot of land-based work. That means, for example, crane suppliers, the onshore wind supply chain in Wales can benefit or diversify. And we saw that, for example, in Kincardine, in the first stage project. Kincardine, in principle, use onshore wind companies like Greencat to help them with their load out in Dundee. The same things could be true in Wales. So this is a big opportunity, and we have time to get it right as well, and time to invest in supply chain and help it.
Okay, thank you, Math. Well, I think on that note, I will draw the event to a close. I really thank you all intensely for your participation. Special thanks to all the presenters. As ever, it takes time to put these presentations together, and then for the time to be spared to give them to us. I think what we've seen is clearly a great opportunity, and we will be following it very closely, and we'll bring to you further events around it. I've already mentioned supply chain, and I am sure that there will be others over the coming months. Finally, I personally would just like to thank the MEW team, specifically, particularly Jay Shepherd, who put together the webinar and the agenda. So Jay, thank you for that. To Beth for helping me out, steering us through the webinar. I hope you found it interesting and inspiring. I think it's a great opportunity and it can't fail to be inspiring, can it? So I will leave on that note. And again, thank you everybody, and keep your eye out for future webinar events, which will be on our website, through our newsletter, etc., through all the communication channels that we would normally use. So thank you all, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.